Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. Thanks very much for this. So, just before I start, actually, just in terms of this, I mean, just as my background, for those that don't know me, I was 20 years as an analyst in the city. I covered media and tech. I was twice Analyst of the Year. During that time, I set up my own business. But actually, for the purposes of this presentation, what's probably also quite relevant to know as well, my background is I trained as a historian, and more recently as a war historian on this. And that's become more relevant why I actually mention this, sort of when I go through some of the slides on the presentation. So this presentation really came about sort of as an email sort of exchange between myself and sort of the MediaTel guys and saying, well, yeah, we're talking about sort of what's the problem with TV and so forth, and they say, well, actually, it's encapsulated in the name of your conference, the future of TV. TV is seen as very outdated on there. In fact, I think sort of the logo that's used is a 1960s TV set. And that's the image that very much has been portrayed by TV, that it's backwards. It's certainly a view that the stock markets have of TV stocks. This is the 12-month performance, looking at various TV names within the space. For those who can see, Netflix is by far the stellar performer out there. You've got names like Comcast, which really at this point is seen more as a broadband company than anything else. You've got a few broadcasting names in Southern Europe who essentially are there. I mentioned the S&P 500 because that's the US stock market average, and that's essentially taken as a benchmark for major stocks. What you can see there is that most of the broadcasting names underperform. Some of them very significantly have underperformed the performance of the market. And some of that is to do with cyclical reasons. Viaplay has had profit warnings. Yet again, TV advertising in the second half of the year has not been great. A lot of it is, quite frankly, though, the stock markets don't like the idea sort of a TV. They just think TV is outdated and it's old. And I would argue that's actually sort of a mindset that has very much sort of traveled into the industry. You know, I say here that TV's fallen into the newspaper trap, and I mentioned sort of what's on here with Mean Girls. For me, the deal that Paramount sort of signed recently, and apologies for anyone from Paramount in the room, but the deal that they signed with TikTok recently epitomizes essentially that mindset trap that essentially TV looks to be falling in the same way that newspapers did. Look at TikTok, what's it trying to do? It's trying to steal TV advertising revenues. Trying to go to advertisers and say, we are a credible alternative to TV. What is its biggest barrier to doing that? It's essentially having brand-safe, credible content, professional content, that essentially advertisers will accept. And what has Paramount done? Well, Paramount's actually given them that content, probably for a relatively small amount in terms of that. I mean, I don't know in terms of the deal, but certainly the value to somebody like a TikTok and similar deals will be exponential. The reason for that is they can take this content, go to their advertisers and say, your biggest concern, you like our audiences, but you were concerned about our content. Here now is essentially sort of content that we can use on our platform, and this is why you should advertise with us. Now, I'll sort of go later sort of onto sort of this in more detail, but what I would say now is there's absolutely no way that what TikTok's doing in terms of slicing and dicing the content in terms of Mean Girls and putting ads on it, why that's beyond the wit of the TV companies. And that's really what they should be focusing on. And I'd say also as well that TV has got itself into a bit of a panic. There is a difference between the US and the European markets. There is no doubt about that. The right-hand side is the data from Nielsen. In terms of audience data, I'm sure you've seen a lot of that before. You can see what's happening in terms of broadcast and cable and what's coming down. Even there, I would argue that this is very much self-inflicted. One of the points that I've actually said in terms of streaming, and for those who sort of saw my presentation at the start of 2022, when we're saying why the streaming giants, essentially that market, wouldn't see the growth that people thought and would essentially get into a stalemate. One of the points I made there was that what the major media companies should have done was try and reform the existing system rather than go D2C. What they effectively did was kill the existing ecosystem in the US, and they accelerated its decline. But we are where we are on that. But if you take in terms of European markets, most of the most watched programs are still on the major terrestrial broadcasters. The streamers still struggle to actually get mass market programs that audiences want. So TV actually has a hell of a lot of strengths. But why is it therefore the case that essentially the sort of TV in some ways seems to be a bit of a panic? Well, yeah, and this is where I start to mention some of the history points on here. Fellow on the left-hand side, many of you recognize is Karl Marx, but from a historian standpoint, there's a school of thought which is called the Marxist School of History that says essentially history is predetermined, that all we are is on the path to a certain element, and there's nothing really that can sort of change the final destination. Now, what's quite interesting is probably the biggest proponents of the Marxist school, that deterministic view at the moment, are the tech companies. Listen to any tech company and they will tell you that essentially the future is tech. It's guaranteed, you can't do anything about it. In fact, if you look, I think it was the October version of Wired in the UK, they had the CTO of OpenAI essentially say, yeah, you have to accept what we're doing, and if you don't, then tough luck, it's gonna happen. Yeah, this is the future. But that's actually not how history works. Put on the right-hand side, Kitchener on there. What you tend to find with history is it tends to sort of very long sort of periods where things are very stable, and then you get very sudden, sharp, sort of violent changes, which brings it up to a new level, and then it goes again on stability. Wars are called the locomotive of change for that reason. There's a huge amount of volatility that occurs in a short amount of time, causes permanent effects, and brings history up to another level. But when thinking about this, was thought there was another analogy here that was quite useful in terms of war and so forth, and what we're seeing TV and tech and what happened with newspapers in the past, is that in any war, actually, if you are the attacker, the best thing you can get is for your opponent to surrender. Now, that can be by overwhelming force, but often actually that is by demoralizing the opposing side, by essentially saying there is no point in fighting because things are already predetermined. And that's essentially sort of where we stand at the moment with very much what tech has said. Listen to a lot of the speeches that you hear. It's essentially that TV is a declining industry. There is nothing you can do about it. There is no growth you will ever get back that will come from it. A lot of it is essentially from people with a vested interest in essentially who wants TV's advertising money. If they can persuade you that essentially that is the future, and that essentially you should effectively surrender and sort of do things on their own terms, they've effectively won the battle, and they've won the battle at little cost to themselves. And the sort of example that we'd like to point on here of why things are not inevitable is actually what happened with the rise of Facebook and Google back in 2008. Again, there is a view that this was very much sort of predetermined, that Facebook and Google were always going to dominate the market. Actually, that's not the case. They got very lucky. And they got very lucky with 4 factors that came together at the same time. If any one of these single factors had not been present, then essentially the landscape in advertising would be completely different today to what it is. And the 4 factors were going from the left, an ultra-liberal regulatory environment that was epitomized by the Obama administration, that was heavily influenced by tech, the printing of free money post the 2008 global financial crisis that meant the cost of capital was effectively zero, the rollout of 3G and particularly 4G when it came to the telco companies and the amount of money that they spent there, that particularly allowed the development of mobile apps, and finally, the weakness of newspapers and the bad structural decisions and strategic decisions that they actually made. And that last factor gets sort of ignored a lot, but it was actually the single biggest factor why Facebook and Google ate the revenues of newspapers and directories. Come on to this sort of this point, and what do I mean by that? Well, sort of from a historian standpoint, there's a phrase that goes for revolutions that successful revolutions tend to have 3 components. They tend to have a fanatical minority, an apathetic majority, and a weak authority. Now, in the case of this is from the Russian Revolution, I trust that most people recognize Lenin. The right-hand side is the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, who was seen as very weak. The middle is meant to represent the Russian population that was very weak and hungry after 4 years of war. Newspapers, if you do the analogy with newspapers, the fanatical minority was tech. Google and Facebook saying, we are ideal substitutes for these revenues, and advertisers should move their money across. The apathetic majority were advertisers, didn't really care where their money went, as long as they thought it was actually sort of a platform that could give them the audiences. The weak authority was the newspapers, made bad strategic decisions, effectively lost confidence, and essentially by the end, pretty much ended up playing the sort of tech game. Plus also as well, again, the sort of idea that you could take what worked in newspapers and just put it into a digital format. Yeah, point being here is that TV risks falling into the same trap. If you look at the fanatical minority, it's, they're not fanatics, but YouTube and TikTok who say, we should get TV advertising money. Most advertisers don't really care which platform they want the audience is. The question is whether TV is going to be the weak authority, and at the moment the signs are not particularly sort of great on that. One thing that we'd particularly say about that, yeah, and it's a mixture of things, AVOD, for example. Most broadcasters seem to use AVOD really at the moment as a circle sort of to protect their linear revenues, rather than necessarily look at the tip of the spear to go into the digital space. So what can TV do on there? Well, I think one thing just to bear in mind, just in terms of mindset, is that things are not as bad as they look. Again, the US and Europe are different, but if you take what sort of the UK, this is data from Ofcom, the 2023 numbers, we all know the UK TV advertising market is quite weak sort of at the moment. But if you look for 2022, in terms of the TV ad numbers there for the total market, you're pretty much looking at pre-pandemic levels and being above. Okay, adjust for inflation, yeah, it's below. But this is not the same as what happened with newspapers. Yeah, that effectively TV still has a lot of loyalty within the space. But probably what's more sort of important here is working out what we call your core competency. And again, so this goes back to the brand point of looking at things at TV. I wouldn't look at TV's sort of core competency as effectively linear TV and broadcasting in that way with AVOD essentially been a platform. The way I would look at sort of the strength of the industry and its core competency is essentially you can provide brand safe, professionally generated content that has a mass distribution and an audience that wants to watch it. That is extremely valuable. And the reason why I mentioned Virgin here, think about how a record label went into offering travel, insurance, wine, credit cards, airlines. How could a record label do that? Because what actually Branson realized, his core competency, was not that he was running a record label, it was the strength of his brand and the values that actually sort of encapsulated to audiences. Something you could trust, something that was a bit edgy, something that people wouldn't necessarily like. Once I actually realized that, the number of areas that you could go into expanded. And this is where sort of would come back in terms of the video point, when look at sort of for TV. And I go back sort of to the Mean Girls example here. This is essentially sort of short video content on here. You look at the categories on there, and when speaking with TV companies will say, well, we don't want to get into short form video. We're not interested in user-generated content, the brand concerns, et cetera, fine. And certainly it's number 3, number 4 category on there. But look at all the other categories that are on there. How to. Why can't TV be doing that? It's got cooking shows, DIY shows, news, which is essentially the sort of bedrock of much of TV. Go further down, comedy programs, entertainment programs, so sports, videos from chat shows. There's a huge amount of short form content that could be used by the TV companies and could actually target audiences that are looking for short form video. It does not have to be about user-generated content on here. And that's why I sort of refer to this as the arsenal of content that broadcasters have. There's a huge amount of content out there in terms of shows produced now and in the past that actually broadcasters can use to try and capture some of this market. Because if TikTok and YouTube are actually turning around and saying, we're alternatives to traditional TV and you should move your TV advertising revenues across, why shouldn't broadcasters be doing the same and saying, well, actually, we're a credible alternative to revenues at the moment that you put on YouTube and TikTok? You want short-form audiences, younger audiences, and so forth. You looked at the slide before. We provide many of the categories that people want in terms of watching that content. Why can't the broadcasters do that? Why can't the broadcasters target that audience? In terms of things, you've got the content. The right-hand side is just an ammunition plant and so forth. But this is what broadcasters have. And the opportunity here is that instead of using the digital products to ring fence what happens in linear TV, if you can actually capture share of digital budgets, then effectively the upside is large. I used Group M numbers from 2022 because that was when they provided the last breakdown, but you can see there their forecast then for TV and what would happen if essentially got 10% of the digital market ex search. To use some of the numbers, then, 2027, you were looking at something like, over a 20% uplift in terms of the amount of money that was available. Now that's 10% share. Yeah, who knows what the share would be? But the potential opportunity for it is huge. So sort of what we'd say as a final point, just on that. I think, I use a sort of picture of sort of a Churchill here. He said a comment, I asterisks newspapers because he didn't talk about newspapers, he actually talked about the French. And this was after the fall of France in 1940. I would say, just as a historical point, that Churchill has been very unfair on the French. The French actually, the soldiers fought very bravely in 1940, and France as a nation had lost well over double the population in World War I that the UK had, and seen a large amount of its country devastated. So there were entire reasons why they weren't so keen to go through the experience again. But that historical tangent aside, the key point still sort of goes here, and this is very, very relevant for TV. What I would say is that TV at the moment sort of risks getting into that very, very same defensive mindset, that essentially talking about the need to actually protect what it has and hold on to it, its all consequences, rather than actually thinking about the opportunities in the future. And that opportunity potentially is around digital revenues, because I go back to this point before, you've got a lot of what is needed, you've got a lot of what advertisers want, you've got the content. You should be able to do this, and you should therefore be able to attract the advertisers that they want. So, as I say at the top, defeat is not inevitable, victory is possible. But really, like in 1940, a lot of it really comes down to mindset. And that's very much it.